Okay, so for anyone out there who loves to really get their teeth into some deep philosophical questions, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving headfirst into animal cognition.
We're going to be looking at it through a really fascinating lens, actually, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Exactly. And what we really want to do with this deep dive is we'll think about how contemporary philosophy, like the stuff happening right now, is grappling with all these incredible scientific discoveries about animal minds.
Because, these discoveries aren't just interesting anecdotes about clever animals. They're really pushing us to rethink some pretty fundamental philosophical assumptions.
That's exactly it. And we're not just talking about, is Fido smart? We're going all the way down to metaphysics, epistemology, even value theory. Big stuff.
Yeah, I mean, philosophers have been fascinated by animal minds for centuries. You've got all the big names weighing in: Aristotle, Aquinas, Kant, Descartes, all wrestling with this question.
But now, with the explosion of research in animal cognition, we've got this whole new wave of data that's demanding we take a fresh look at those classic ideas.
Yeah, and some of the things we're finding are pretty mind-blowing. You've got complex social behavior in, believe it or not, girder snakes.
Tool use in ants, fish that can recognize themselves. And not just in a mirror, we're talking about potential self-recognition in other ways, too.
There's evidence of empathy in rats. Dogs that seem to remember specific events from their past.
And get this, bees that can do basic arithmetic.
It really makes you wonder what's going on in those little fuzzy heads.
So before we go any further, let's get clear on the basics here. For a philosopher, what is animal cognition? How do we even define it?
Well, at its core, you can think of cognition as the processes that enable an animal to behave flexibly and adaptively to reach its goals. And all of this happens through the processing of information, taking in the world around them, and making decisions based on that.
Right, it's how they understand and interact with their environment.
Exactly. And comparative cognition, as a scientific field, is systematically investigating these behaviors and the mechanisms behind them. How animals represent information internally, how they learn, how they solve problems.
So science is showing us the how, the nuts and bolts of animal behavior. But then philosophy comes in and asks the bigger questions.
Exactly. Like, do these processes imply that animals have beliefs? Are they conscious?
Does their communication tell us anything about whether they have thoughts? Are they capable of reasoning rationally?
It's like taking those familiar philosophical questions about the human mind and seeing them in a whole new light through the lens of different biological systems.
That's such a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And one of the really cool things about animal cognition research is that it's not just focused on the animals we typically think of as smart, like primates or dolphins.
Right. It's branching out to all sorts of species, including those we might not usually associate with complex cognition: worms, honeybees, even spiders.
And by doing so, we're getting a much broader perspective on those fundamental philosophical concepts we were talking about. It makes you wonder if our human-centered view has been limiting our understanding all along.
It definitely challenges the traditional idea of a hierarchy of intelligence, with humans at the top and everything else ranked below us.
That old scala naturae idea.
Exactly. Instead, there's been a shift towards appreciating the incredible diversity of cognitive abilities that have evolved to allow animals to thrive in their specific environments.
So it's not about ranking intelligence on some universal scale. It's about understanding how different cognitive solutions have evolved to fit different ecological niches.
Exactly. It's about fitness for purpose.
Mhm.
And this whole idea of looking at mental abilities across species really goes back to Darwin, right? With his idea of mental continuity.
Right, that groundbreaking idea that the differences between human and animal minds are more about degree than kind, that we're all on a continuum.
Exactly. And his argument that our complex mental faculties, the things that make us us, arose gradually through evolution.
Suggests that we share underlying psychological mechanisms with other animals.
Right. And if you read his book, The Descent of Man, you can see how he wasn't shy about drawing those parallels between human and animal psychology.
He even attributed things like imagination and reason to animals based on his observations.
Though, looking back now, some of his interpretations might seem a bit, well, maybe he was a little too generous with some of those attributions.
Maybe a touch. But you have to remember, his work was revolutionary in suggesting that these psychological capacities weren't unique to humans. He opened the door to systematically studying those things in other animals, emotions, memory, even aesthetic sensibilities.
Absolutely. He was really a pioneer. But it's important to remember that evolution also highlights the differences between species.
Right, because natural selection shapes minds to fit particular environments, so you end up with both shared and unique psychological traits.
Exactly. A truly Darwinian approach recognizes both the continuities and the discontinuities. Different environments will favor different cognitive solutions. So while we might see fundamental similarities in learning processes across species, the specific ways those processes manifest, the problems they're used to solve, can be vastly different.
Right, it's like evolution is a master tinkerer, coming up with all sorts of clever solutions to the challenges animals face in their lives.
Exactly. And since Darwin, the field has really taken off, drawing in contributions from all sorts of different areas. You've got learning theorists, ethologists studying animal behavior in the wild, even researchers looking at animal culture. It's a truly interdisciplinary effort.
Right, it's not just one field. It's a melting pot of ideas and approaches, which makes it so exciting.
It does. You've got the rigorous experimental designs of behaviorism, the detailed observational studies of ethology, and the insights from research into social learning and cultural transmission. And we shouldn't forget those early attempts to grapple with animal consciousness directly.
Right, because that's a question that's been lingering for centuries.
Absolutely. And all of this historical and interdisciplinary work has led to the vibrant field of animal cognition we have today, pulling together insights from psychology, anthropology, and biology.
So when we talk about animal cognition, we're really talking about studying the psychological states and capacities that actually cause animals to behave the way they do. And those are the same sorts of things philosophers are interested in when they talk about the mind in general.
Hmm.
You mentioned Donald Griffin earlier. How did his work influence this renewed philosophical interest in animal minds?
Yeah, Griffin was really a key figure in bringing those questions back to the forefront. His book, The Question of Animal Awareness, was a real game changer.
It really challenged the scientific taboo against talking about animal thinking and consciousness.
Exactly. It was like he was saying, look, these are legitimate scientific questions that deserve rigorous study. And his work really inspired a new wave of collaboration between scientists and philosophers, which has led to the nuanced discussions we're having today.
Okay, so we've talked about what animal cognition is and how the field has developed over time. But, we're philosophers here. We can't just take scientific findings at face value. We need to think about the philosophical assumptions that are baked into the study of animal cognition itself.
Oh, absolutely. Like any scientific field, animal cognition research operates within a framework of philosophical assumptions. These assumptions shape the questions researchers ask, the methods they use, and how they interpret their findings.
Right, it's like those assumptions are the lens through which we're viewing the data.
Exactly. And they often become visible when we start to look at how scientists define the very capacities they're investigating.
Can you give an example? Like, how does defining something like altruism or cooperation involve philosophical commitments?
Sure. Take cooperation, for instance. A scientist might design an experiment where two animals work together to get a reward, and they might define that as cooperation.
Seems straightforward enough.
Right. But then a philosopher might come along and ask, hold on, does this behavior actually reflect a shared goal, a true understanding of the other's role? Or could it be driven by purely individual motivations that just happen to align? The way the scientist operationally defines cooperation carries with it implicit philosophical assumptions about what cooperation really is.
Interesting. So even something as seemingly simple as defining what we're studying can involve philosophical baggage.
Absolutely. And the same goes for other concepts like empathy. Defining empathy solely in terms of emotional contagion, like one animal mirroring another's emotions.
That bypasses a whole philosophical debate about whether true empathy requires a cognitive understanding of the other's experience, seeing the world from their point of view.
Exactly. So these definitional choices aren't neutral. They have profound implications for what we study, how we study it, and what conclusions we draw.
It's like those assumptions are shaping the entire research landscape. You mentioned theory-ladenness and value-ladenness earlier. Let's dig into those a bit more. Starting with theory-ladenness, how do our existing theoretical frameworks, our pre-existing ideas about how minds work, influence how we observe and interpret animal cognition?
Okay, well, theory-ladenness basically highlights how our pre-existing theoretical commitments can shape our observations and even the very definitions we use. In animal cognition, one of the most fundamental background theories is about the degree of mental continuity or discontinuity between humans and other species.
You mean whether we see animal minds as fundamentally similar to ours or radically different?
Exactly. So if you lean towards a strong continuity view, You might be more likely to interpret ambiguous behaviors as evidence of more sophisticated cognitive abilities in animals.
It's like the classic romantics versus killjoys debate that Dennett talked about. You know, those who readily see human-like intelligence in animals versus those who are much more skeptical.
That's a perfect example. And those broad theoretical stances can really color how researchers view animal behavior. But theory-ladenness can operate at more specific levels, too.
How so?
Well, for example, think about the false belief task. It's widely used to study theory of mind.
Right, that classic test where you see if an individual understands that someone else can have a false belief about the world.
Exactly. And the widespread use of that task was directly inspired by philosophical theories in functionalism about how beliefs and desires drive actions. So the methodology itself is rooted in a specific theoretical understanding of mental states.
Wow, so a philosophical theory directly shapes a scientific research tool. That's amazing. What about the research on social learning in apes? There's been a lot of focus on the concept of cumulative culture, right? How does theory-ladenness play a role there?
Right. So much of that research on ape social learning is framed by the importance placed on cumulative culture, this idea that humans uniquely build upon past innovations, constantly ratcheting up our knowledge and technology.
Right, like we're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Exactly. And over-imitation, where an individual copies even seemingly irrelevant actions, is often seen as a key mechanism for this cultural accumulation.
Because it ensures that the full complexity of the behavior is transmitted.
Right. But when apes don't readily over-imitate in experiments, it's often interpreted as a failure on their part, a failure to grasp this crucial element of human cultural transmission. But there's another way to interpret that same behavior.
How so?
Well, you could see it as apes being more efficient learners, focusing only on the actions that are actually necessary to achieve the goal. So what looks like a failure from one theoretical perspective might be seen as adaptive efficiency from another. And that failure interpretation, I think, really reflects a theoretical bias towards the human model of cumulative culture as the benchmark.
So interesting how our assumptions about what makes human culture special can shade how we interpret what's going on in other animals' minds. Okay, so we've covered theory-ladenness. Now let's tackle value-ladenness. How do our values, the things we consider important or worthy of study, seep into animal cognition research?
Well, value-ladenness is all about how scientists' values, their beliefs about what's important, good, or worth investigating, can influence their research choices.
So it's not just about following the data wherever it leads. Our values can shape the direction of the research itself.
Exactly. And a classic example is the historical emphasis on teaching language to apes.
Right, like Washu the chimp and Koko the gorilla.
Exactly. And the immense value we place on linguistic communication as a hallmark of intelligence, well, that clearly drove a lot of research in that area.
Because if we could show that animals could use language like we do, that would really change our view of them.
Right. And our values can also shape our methodological preferences.
Like what kind of studies we consider most valuable.
Exactly. So the perceived rigor and control of laboratory experiments often leads them to be valued more highly than naturalistic field studies.
Even though field studies might provide more ecologically valid insights.
Exactly. It's about what we consider most scientifically rigorous. And then there's the interpretation of results, which we touched on a bit earlier. It seems like our inherent desire to see ourselves as superior can really influence how we understand other animals.
It's like we're always looking for ways to confirm our special place in the world.
It's a very human tendency, and you see it play out in all sorts of subtle ways in animal cognition research.
Like how?
Well, think about the examples where chimpanzees outperform human children on certain tasks.
Like gaze following or working memory.
Exactly. And yet, the conclusions often focus on a human superiority in other related but distinct abilities, like theory of mind or abstract reasoning.
It's like we move the goalposts to maintain that sense of human exceptionalism.
Right. And you see it with the ultimatum game, where chimpanzees sometimes act in ways that seem more rational than humans, but then we say they lack some human-like sense of fairness. Or the mirror self-recognition test, which relies heavily on visual cues and assumes that self-recognition should manifest as an interest in one's appearance.
It's like we're designing tests tailored to human-like abilities and then declaring victory when animals don't perform in exactly the same way.
Exactly. And this all ties into a bigger issue about objectivity in science, particularly in a field so closely tied to our understanding of ourselves in relation to the natural world.
Right, because if our values and pre-existing theories are shaping our research, how can we be sure we're getting an objective picture of animal minds?
It's a real challenge. Objectivity, that ideal of pursuing knowledge that's free from values and theoretical biases, it's a guiding principle in science, but it's incredibly difficult to achieve in practice.
Because our perspectives inevitably shape what we see and how we interpret it.
Exactly. And in animal cognition research, the risk of bias is particularly high, I think. We have this long history of viewing animals through an anthropocentric lens.
Right, either projecting our own traits onto them or denying shared capacities to maintain a sense of human uniqueness.
Exactly. And that's where Morgan's canon and the whole debate about anthropomorphism come in.
Right, because Morgan's canon was formulated to guard against unwarranted anthropomorphism, that tendency to attribute human-like mental states to animals without sufficient evidence.
Exactly. He urged us to interpret an action in terms of the lowest possible psychological faculty. The simplest explanation that fits the data.
And that classic example of Tony the Fox Terrier illustrates his point perfectly. Instead of assuming complex planning to escape the yard, Morgan argued for a simpler explanation based on trial and error learning.
Right. It's a great illustration of how our intuition can sometimes lead us to overestimate an animal's cognitive abilities.
And for a long time, anthropomorphism was like this big taboo in animal cognition research, seen as a cardinal sin. But more recently, there's been a more nuanced discussion about its potential pitfalls and the dangers of going too far in the other direction.
Exactly. So while anthropomorphism, in its negative sense, refers to mistakenly attributing human-like traits to animals.
There's also the danger of what DeWalt calls anthropodenial, this a priori rejection of shared similarities between humans and animals, even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
Right, and that can lead us to underestimate animal cognitive capacities. And then Andrews and Huss coined the term anthropectomy to describe the error of denying an animal possesses a human-like capacity when they actually do.
So it's a balancing act. We need to be cautious about projecting our own minds onto animals, but we also need to be open to the possibility that they might share some of our cognitive abilities.
Right, it's about finding that middle ground, that sweet spot between over and under attribution. And Morgan himself actually cautioned against both extremes, exaggerating human capacities and wrongly denying shared traits. He called it Morgan's challenge.
Makes sense. And then there's this idea of anthropofabulation, which takes things a step further.
Yeah, that's when we construct these idealized or even inaccurate models of human cognition and then fail to find the specific mechanisms in animals.
And that can lead to false conclusions about discontinuity.
Exactly. It's like we're setting up animals to fail by using a flawed model of our own minds as the standard. And this all ties back into how we choose our explanations. Morgan's canon advocates for simpler explanations, and this preference for simplicity seems to be another key philosophical assumption in animal cognition research.
Right, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best. But is it always so straightforward when we're talking about animal minds and their evolutionary history?
That's a great question. And philosophers of science have been questioning whether simplicity is always the most reliable guide to truth, particularly in evolutionary biology. Because natural selection doesn't necessarily favor the simplest solutions. It favors solutions that work, that enhance survival and reproduction.
So a seemingly more complex cognitive mechanism might actually be more advantageous in certain environments.
Exactly. And sometimes the preference for simplicity can mask a desire to avoid anthropomorphism, which we were just talking about.
It's like we're so worried about over-attributing that we end up under-attributing.
Right. And it's important to remember that simplicity itself isn't a single concept. There are different ways an explanation can be considered simple.
Like what?
Well, there's the idea of psychological unity, the notion that all minds operate according to the same basic principles. Or parsimony of mental representations, the idea that the simplest explanation involves the fewest mental states or processes. There's also the idea of less cognitive sophistication, the idea that animals are using simpler cognitive mechanisms than we might initially assume.
Right, so we're talking about different levels of analysis, different ways of slicing the pie.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of simplicity as analogy, where we use our understanding of human cognition as a starting point for understanding animal minds. Or evolutionary parsimony, the idea that the simplest explanation involves the fewest evolutionary changes.
Right, so it's not just about finding the explanation that's most intuitively simple. It's about considering different kinds of
Is
simplicity.
And within each of those, there are further distinctions related to things like computational cost, data requirements, or the number of phylogenetic changes involved. And a great example of how these competing claims of simplicity can play out is the ongoing debate about theory of mind in chimpanzees. Whether they actually reason about mental states or simply predict behavior based on observable cues.
Right, it's a classic example of how philosophical assumptions can shape the interpretation of scientific findings.
Absolutely. And resolving those disputes often requires some pretty deep philosophical analysis of what we really mean by simplicity in a given context.
Okay, so to recap our discussion of assumptions, we see objectivity and simplicity as guiding ideals in science, but they're constantly being negotiated through the inherent theory-ladenness and value-ladenness of the research process. And in animal cognition, these tensions are especially prominent because of our unique relationship with the animal kingdom and the enduring questions about where we fit in.
Precisely. And those assumptions aren't just abstract philosophical points, they have real-world consequences. They shape our understanding of animal minds, and ultimately, they influence how we treat them.
Right, because if we believe animals are just mindless machines, we'll treat them very differently than if we believe they have thoughts, feelings, and complex inner lives.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the final part of our exploration. How is the research from animal cognition being applied within philosophy itself? It's not just about the philosophy of animal cognition anymore, is it?
No, it's moving beyond that. We're seeing findings from animal cognition research being used as premises in philosophical arguments across a range of different areas. But you mentioned that we need to be careful here. Why is that?
Well, the way a specific cognitive capacity is defined and measured in a scientific experiment might not line up perfectly with the philosophical concept it's meant to illuminate.
You mean the terms might be the same, like belief, consciousness, communication, but the underlying concepts might be subtly different?
Exactly. The operational definitions, the theoretical frameworks, can differ quite a bit between the scientific and philosophical domains. So, careful translation and critical evaluation are essential when drawing connections between the two. And in some cases, philosophical theories might actually make specific predictions about animal psychology.
Leading to a close relationship between the philosophical theory and the interpretation of the scientific findings.
Exactly. It can be a bit circular at times.
Okay, so rigor and careful conceptual analysis are key when bridging that gap between science and philosophy. With that in mind, let's look at some specific examples. How has animal cognition research informed our understanding of the classic problem of other minds, that age-old question of how we know that other beings have minds like our own?
Well, the problem of other minds, which is already a tough one when we're considering other humans, becomes even more challenging when we're thinking about animals.
Because there's a greater biological and behavioral gulf between us.
Exactly. And the traditional argument from analogy, where we infer mental states based on similarities in behavior.
That becomes much weaker when applied across species,
Right.
because the behavioral repertoire and the underlying biology can be so diverse.
Exactly. So those direct comparisons are less reliable. But philosophers have been exploring alternative approaches that draw on evidence from animal cognition, like the inference to the best explanation.
Right, where we argue that the existence of minds in animals is the most plausible explanation for their complex behavior.
Exactly. We observe their problem solving, their social interactions, their learning abilities, and it just makes the most sense to say that there are mental states going on there.
Like, what else could account for that level of complexity and flexibility?
Right. And then there's the argument from evolutionary parsimony.
Which says that species closely related to us are more likely to share psychological traits inherited from a common ancestor.
Exactly. But even here, as the philosopher Elliot Sober has pointed out, while phylogenetic closeness increases the probability of shared traits, it doesn't guarantee the exact same cognitive capacities.
Right, so just because we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, that doesn't mean their minds are exactly like ours.
Exactly. And it seems like these inferential arguments, while drawing on evidence from animal cognition, still face some limitations when trying to definitively solve the problem of other minds.
So are we just stuck with uncertainty?
Not necessarily. You mentioned earlier that Dale Jameson offers a different perspective.
Right. He suggests that the solution lies more in our engagement with animals than in logical inference.
Exactly. He argues that our skepticism about animal minds often stems from a philosophical predisposition to see them as fundamentally different from us.
It's like we start with the assumption that they don't have minds, and then we look for evidence to confirm that.
Right. And Jameson suggests that by engaging with animals, by observing their behavior in rich contexts, and by developing relationships with them, we move beyond the need for logical proofs. We come to a more intuitive understanding of their mental lives.
So it's about experiencing their minds directly, rather than just trying to infer them from afar.
Exactly. And he argues that presuming a degree of mental life in animals, similar to how we generally presume it in other humans, actually allows for more fruitful inquiry and understanding.
So instead of starting with doubt, we start with a presumption of mind.
Right. And that shift in perspective can make all the difference.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem of other minds. What about the mind-body problem, that perennial philosophical puzzle about the relationship between mental states and physical processes? How has animal cognition research contributed to that debate?
Well, the incredible diversity of ways in which cognition and behavior are instantiated in non-human animals provides valuable data for different mind-body theories.
Because if minds is just a product of the brain, you'd expect to see a very tight correlation between brain structure and cognitive abilities.
Right. But what we're finding is that there's a lot more flexibility than we might have initially thought.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about Putnam's famous argument for multiple realizability, the idea that a single mental state can be realized by different physical substrates. He used the example of octopus pain to illustrate this point.
Because octopuses have such a different nervous system than we do, yet they still seem to experience pain.
Exactly. And contemporary research on octopuses, with their decentralized nervous system and evidence of independent decision-making in their arms, continues to challenge traditional brain-centric views of mind. It supports theories of embodied cognition, the idea that mind is not just in the head, but extends out into the body and the environment.
So the octopus is like a walking, swimming embodiment of multiple realizability,
It really is. And then you have research on organisms without neurons, like slime molds and some plants, that show evidence of learning and associative capacities.
which really pushes the boundaries of what we consider mind.
It does. It challenges that idea that mentality is inextricably tied to specific neurobiological structures.
Okay, so animal cognition research is forcing us to broaden our conception of the physical basis of mind. Now, let's talk about consciousness. That's a real philosophical minefield, and animal studies seem to be playing an increasingly important role in navigating it. How so?
Absolutely. Research on animal brains and behavior is providing crucial data points for different theories of consciousness. You've got theory-first approaches, like Carruthers' global workspace theory, which often deny consciousness in animals because they lack certain human-like neural structures.
So it's like they're starting with a theory of consciousness that's very specific to human brains, and then using that to rule out consciousness in animals.
Right. And then you have more data-driven approaches, like Tye's panic theory, which suggests that consciousness is much more widespread, potentially including many animal species, based on the idea that consciousness arises from the processing of sensory information and the ability to evaluate that information.
So the same data can lead to radically different conclusions depending on your starting assumptions. It sounds like a real theory-first standoff.
It is, and breaking that deadlock might require a different approach altogether. Some philosophers argue that just as we justifiably presume the existence of an external world and the consciousness of other humans, we should adopt a similar pre-theoretical stance towards animal consciousness.
So we start with the assumption that they are conscious, and then see where that leads us.
Exactly. And if that presumption leads to fruitful research and help us better understand animal behavior, then it might be a more productive starting point.
It's like giving animals the benefit of the doubt, rather than starting from a position of skepticism.
Exactly. And then there are marker-based approaches, which try to identify observable or measurable indicators of conscious experience based on what we know about human phenomenology.
So we look for signs of consciousness that we can actually observe.
Right. And Varner's focus on pain indicators falls into this category, as does Tye's application of Newton's principle, where we infer similar conscious causes from similar behavioral effects. And then you have Ginsburg and Jablonka's theory, linking consciousness to unlimited associative learning, the ability to form complex associations between different stimuli.
So there are all sorts of different ways to approach the question of animal consciousness.
Absolutely. And there's a real meta-level debate about which approach is most productive. Some philosophers, like Birch, advocate for a more theory-light approach, focusing on observable behaviors and their functional significance. Others, like Schwitzgebel, caution against imposing our human-centric theories of consciousness onto beings with potentially very different subjective experiences.
Right, because we don't want to assume that their consciousness is just like ours.
Exactly. And then you have Andrews's dynamic marker approach, which tries to bridge this gap by starting with well-understood animals and then looking for analogous markers of consciousness in less familiar species.
It's like we're building a ladder of consciousness, starting with creatures we're more confident about and then working our way up.
That's a good analogy.
Okay, consciousness is clearly a complex puzzle. Let's move on to thought itself. The question of whether animals actually think has been a major sticking point for philosophers.
Yes, it has. And historically, language has played a central role in this debate.
Because Descartes famously argued that thought is inextricably linked to language.
Exactly. And since animals lack language, at least in the human sense, he concluded that they must also lack thought.
That's a pretty radical claim.
It is, and it had a huge influence on subsequent philosophical thinking. Centuries later, Davidson echoed this sentiment, arguing that true thought, particularly the holding of beliefs, requires language and the ability to grasp the concept of belief, which he argued animals lacked.
So it's not just about using language. It's about understanding the very idea of belief, that someone can have a representation of the world that might be true or false.
Exactly. And he used the famous example of a dog chasing a cat to illustrate his point.
Because we might say the dog believes the cat is there, but Davidson argued that we can't really attribute that kind of belief to the dog without a shared linguistic framework.
Right. It's like we're imposing our own concepts onto the dog's behavior.
But these strong claims against animal thought haven't gone unchallenged.
Definitely not. Many philosophers have pointed out that we face similar challenges when attributing beliefs to other humans, even those who do have language. We can never know for sure what's going on in someone else's mind.
So the problem isn't unique to animals. It's a fundamental epistemological problem.
Exactly. And they argue that we can gain knowledge about animal thought through careful empirical research.
Even if that thought isn't expressed or structured in the same way as human linguistic thought.
Right. And the assumption that all thought must be propositional, expressed in sentences, has also been questioned.
So maybe animals have other ways of thinking.
Exactly. They might have non-propositional or imagistic forms of thought that still guide their behavior.
It's like we're so focused on language that we might be missing other forms of mental representation.
It's possible. And all of this research is prompting philosophers to rethink the relationship between language and thought.
So what are some of the more recent philosophical perspectives on animal thought and its connection to language?
While some philosophers, like Elizabeth Camp, have suggested that animals might have compositional representational systems that, while not propositional like human language, still allow for complex and structured thought.
So their thoughts might be structured differently, but still have that combinatorial power.
Exactly. And then you have Fodor's famous language of thought hypothesis, which suggests that all thought in both humans and animals has an underlying language-like structure, even if animals lack an external spoken or signed language.
So it's like there's a mental language that underlies all thought.
That's the idea. And there's also an ongoing debate about whether animals have true concepts or if their mental content is primarily non-conceptual.
Right, because concepts are these abstract mental representations that allow us to categorize and generalize our experience.
Exactly. And there's growing philosophical interest in exploring the possibility of rational thought processes in animals, looking for evidence of logical reasoning, causal reasoning, even statistical reasoning.
So it's not just about whether they think, it's about how they think.
Exactly. And all of this research is challenging our assumptions about the nature of thought itself.
It's amazing how studying animal communication is also feeding back into philosophical theories of meaning and language. We often think of human language as uniquely sophisticated, but what are we learning from how animals communicate?
It's a fascinating area. Philosophers have often looked to Grice's theory of meaning, which emphasizes the role of intentions in communication. And Dennett, interpreting Grice, suggested that true communication requires third-order beliefs and a theory of mind.
So to truly communicate, you need to understand that the other person has beliefs, and that those beliefs might be about your own beliefs.
Exactly. It's a pretty high cognitive bar, but some philosophers have argued that this sets the bar too high.
Because we